In this math video, we're going to be learning about percentage discounts. So there are a couple of things that you need to know before we begin. The first thing you need to know is per is a synonym for each or parts. Cent means 100. So if I was to ask you the percent of something, it's asking the parts of out of 100. So if I said I've got 25%, it means that I've got 25 out of 100. Okay. So now we've got this one here, which is of. And of in this circumstance, and you can see it in all of these questions, it also means multiply. Okay. So whenever you see of like this, you may also find this in the fractions of a quantity. You'll find that it means multiply. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to look at this one first. So I'm going to show you a really easy way to figure out percentages and then a couple of different ways that you can do it as well. So the first really easy way to figure out percentages is by knowing that 10% is the same as saying, well, let's divide by 10. So I'm going to move my decimal over to the left in my my whole number here that I'm going to find the percent of. So that would mean that there is an invisible decimal here, and I'm going to move that one over to the left. So 10% of 34 is 3 4/10. Simple as that. 10% then of 6 5/10 would be 65 hundredths. So I've moved the decimal over one to the left. Okay. One way that you can find using that method as well is you can go, okay, well, I'm going to find what 10% of, if you didn't know how to find 50% of 90, you could go, well, I know how to find 10% of 90. I can go, well, I'm going to find 10% of 90, move my decimal once over to the left, and then I'm going to, well, I know that 10% of 90 is 9. I'm going to multiply that by the 5 here, and then I'll find out that it is 45. Okay. Another way you could do this is by saying, if you wanted to use this method that I've told you about already, you could say, well, I know we're trying to find what 25% of 80 is. So if I can find out what 10% is, well, I know that 10% of 80 is 8. So 8 then times 2 because it is 25. 8 times 2 equals 16. But then I've got the 5%, and I can simply find the 5% by saying, well, I knew that 8 times 2, 10% of 80 was 8. So then 5% must be half of 8, so that's 4. So then I know that it's going to be 16 plus 4, which is 20. Okay, so that's one way of finding out percentages. One really easy way to do it just by looking, really. And it's a good strategy to use in your head if you needed to find a percentage of something quickly. Okay, so another way of looking at this is turning this percentage into a decimal. Now, remember, fractions, decimals, percentages, they are all the same, but they're just different representations of exactly the same thing. Okay, so 10%, if we were making a decimal into a percentage, we multiply it by 100. So if we have a percentage, we're going to make it into a decimal, we divide it by that. So then that means that we move our decimal place 2 over. So then we get 1/10 that is like this, looks like this, 1/10. We've moved our decimal 2 places over, 1, 2, and that's where the decimal goes. All right, so we've got our 1/10, and then because we remember that of here means multiply, we multiply 34 by that. Okay, Now you can do this on paper, you can figure it out any way you like really, on the calculator even, but you'll find that I'll do it on the calculator for you so you can see what I'm talking about. So if you went 0.1 times 34, you'll get 3 4/10. So the decimal would move over to the left. And I really encourage you to solve this problem using vertical multiplication and count back in the decimal place for the 1 digit to the right of the decimal. And you'll really see what's going on here. So that's another way of doing it, is to multiply it across. So then you get your 3 4/10. So it's the same with this one. You'll always remember it's very important to remember that you are turning the percentage into the decimal. You don't turn this other number you don't divide that one by 100 to turn it into a decimal. Okay, so you always turn the percentage into the decimal, and then you can multiply that by your number here. All right, and so we'll move on to this one over here. Oh, sorry, there's just this one here as well. So 10% of this one will be 0.65. We'll just do that very quickly. So this one, we know that 100% is the same as a whole. So 50% is the same as half. So it's like asking, what is half of 90? So that's another way of doing it. Whenever you say 50%, you can just halve that number. Okay, and it's a very similar method for this one. So 25% is 1/4. So it's a half of a half. So what you could do is you could say, well, I don't know what that is off the top of my head, 1/4 of 80, but I do know that half of 80 is 40. And so then I've got 40, so I'm going to halve that again to get 20. So that's another way of doing it as well. Dividing it by 4 essentially is what you did. Okay, so 15% of 30. So now you can figure this out by saying, well, what is 10%? Well, that's 3. And then what is 10%, which is 3? And then you can find out what 5% is. Whoops, and plus that on. So if 3 is 10%, then 5 is 1.5. So together it is 4.5. Okay. So now we're going to find what 30% of 20 is, and we can use that same method of saying, well, what is 10%? So 10% of 20 is 2, and then I'm going to multiply that by 3. So 10% is 2, and then 2 times 3 is 6. Okay, 75% of 90. So in this way you can do a couple of different ways. You can find out what 10% of 90 is, which is 9, and then multiply it by 7, and then halve the 9 to add on to your answer there. Or you can again use your calculator and you can turn that percentage into a decimal by dividing it by 100 and then multiplying it by 90. And then you get your 67 and 5/10. All right, so I've left these ones here for you guys to try. So remember to show your working out, and please ask if you have any questions whatsoever. Some of them here, when you see that they are not easy numbers like 5 or 0, you will need to turn these percentages into decimals and multiply across before you can find your answer. It will be very, very tricky to use this method, and it won't work actually if you find the 10% by moving the decimal once to the left. It only works when you have got zeros at the end of your percentage or 5s at the end of your percentage. Okay, good luck.